trying to, it moves screens when I have multiple screens open. Well, welcome again, and this is our Stewardship and Congregational Development Committee second webinar, and it is on wills, legacy gifts, and funeral planning. And I'll just start with a little prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we give thanks that you lead us in life and that you are there for us in death. We ask you to be with us as we enter into this time to learn about ways that we can journey confidently through our life and through that transition into life eternal. As we talk about wills and legacy gifts and funeral planning, be with us, give us peace and comfort, and help us to find the gifts we need to have difficult conversations with our loved ones and to make choices that represent all the gifts that you have bestowed upon us. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, welcome. For those that don't know me, I'm Reverend Trish Miller, and I am the Priest Associate in Leeds Anglican Ministries with the Venerable Nancy MacLeod, who is also with us co-hosting tonight. So glad to be here. I'm the Chair of Stewardship and Congregational Development. I have a passion for the theology of stewardship and how that is so closely integrated with our life as disciples of Christ. So we hope that this topic is good for you. We welcome your feedback. I will make one caveat. I am not a lawyer. I am not a financial planner. I am not a funeral director. So this is really just for sort of discussion and information. It is not any firm decision-making stuff. I encourage you to talk to those professionals if you have any more detailed questions. So I'm going to start with our agenda. We've already done the opening prayer. And we're going to start by talking about wills. I was kind of thinking of this chronologically, sort of you do your will and you plan your legacy gifts as part of your will, and then you do your funeral. So that's sort of the way I have it laid out. Talking about wills, it'll be really some basic questions about why we need one, and more importantly, sort of what happens if I don't have one, how you might go about choosing an executor for your will, what kind of things should you include in your wills? They can be very basic or they can be very detailed. And throughout all of these topics, I'm going to be sort of emphasizing the importance of communication, communicating to our loved ones, communicating to our spouses, communicating to our church family and others. Then we'll talk briefly about legacy gifts, and those are sort of the gifts that we leave to charities in our in our context, but those gifts that we leave after we have died, something that we have made provisions for in our will or through sort of naming charities as beneficiaries to things like insurance policies. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about funeral planning and how not to sort of be afraid, but to sort of dive in and think about really what we'd like to see and how we can maybe ease some of that burden for our loved ones, and what steps can we do now so that when the people we love are in the midst of their grief and loss, that they're more confident in the decisions they make would be representative of what your final legacy is going to be in terms of that funeral service. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion. I'm hoping to get through the slides within sort of that hour, and then have some time for questions and answers, just so everybody's not sitting in front of their computer for too long. Any questions on the agenda? Great. So I'm going to start with the definition of a will. For those that don't know me, my previous career was as a military officer, and every single course started with a definition. So it's just part of my DNA to start a presentation with that. What a will is simply a legal document, and it says how you want your estate to be divided when you die. And that includes both your assets and your liabilities, those things you owe and those things that still have to be paid that are outstanding when you die. You aren't legally mandated or required to have a will, but it's a really, really good idea. There are so many examples of things that can go wrong when people don't have wills, and we'll get into a little bit of that in the next slide or two. One thing people should know as well, even if you have a will, it's a really good idea to keep it updated. In some provinces and territories, if you get married or divorced, it can automatically cancel any previous wills you might have made. So you might have had a will before you got married, and it's now no longer valid. Even if nothing has changed in your will, say for example, you left everything to an only child or multiple children, and you don't need to leave anything to your new spouse, you would still have to redo that will. A couple interesting things about wills. It's really recommended that you see a lawyer about getting one done. They know all the trick questions to ask, all those things you might not have considered, and can guide you in that. But if you have to do it in a hurry, you can do a handwritten will. It's called a holograph. The trick is, though, you have to write that out completely handwritten. It's not like you can go and find a template and type it up and print it and sign it. It has to be completely handwritten for it to be considered as a handwritten will. If you do your own will at home and do type it up and sign it and date it, you would still need 2 witnesses, and those witnesses have to be adults. It could be a coworker, a friend, or neighbor, but they cannot be a beneficiary of your will. They can't be a spouse of a beneficiary at the time of the signing, and of course, they can't be a minor. I learned one interesting thing. A videotape will is not valid in Ontario. So if you had one, you might need a written one. So I don't know about you, but I actually didn't have a valid will after I got married until 5 years into my marriage. My husband and I just got our wills done in March, just as the pandemic was picking up. We had actually started it in February, but by the time March came around, we had some hoops to jump through just to be able to sign it with the lawyer. If you don't have a will, you're not alone. As of 2018, over half Canadians did not have a will. And even 35% of the people who did have wills, their will was not up to date. Now, there has been an increase in the people interested in writing their own wills or having a will prepared for them since the pandemic. And I think it's just put it sort of into that stark reality for us. And I think, you know, for me, it was a sense of responsibility and a sense of I can do something. Everybody has their own reasons, but quite often it's any reason will do. Highly recommend digging your will out, making sure you can still find it, and updating it as required. A lot of people when they're asked why they don't have a will, some people think, well, I'm too young. A will is for somebody who's old, retired, near death, somebody in their 60s, 70s, 80s, people, especially if they don't have families. I have a 27-year-old son, and I can almost guarantee he does not have a will, even though he does have a life insurance policy. Another reason is people think they don't have enough assets. They don't own a home, they don't have any stocks or investments or tangible goods or property to leave to anybody. So why did they need to bother doing a will? And for a lot of people, it's just too expensive. It is cost prohibitive. But what's nice is that there are templates and tools out there. And as I said, you could simply handwrite a will. And you don't even need witnesses for that, long as it's handwritten in your own penmanship for the whole thing. So there's lots of allowances for being able to do it without incurring. Certainly, if you do have a complex estate or a complex family dynamic, really, really recommend getting that professional will service. A couple of the specific situations where you should get a professional are is if you have a history of mental impairment, or if you think that your family could contest that. If you are separated from your spouse, if your estate is especially large, and if you own assets outside of Canada, in those circumstances, it really is important to seek a professional assistance in writing a will, and that would be most likely an estate lawyer. Dying without a will. I'll let you read those points, and I'll go over them briefly in a moment, but I wanted to share a cautionary tale from my own family. My aunt had a home that was left to her by my grandmother, and it was always her intention that that home would then be passed on to her son. And in fact, her son was living in that home with his family. My aunt remarried, and she and her spouse were independently, they had means of their own. Her spouse was fairly well off, certainly better off than she was. They were in a car accident. She died immediately at the scene, and he died a few hours later in hospital. They did not have a will. So the courts decided that when she died, everything automatically went to him, her spouse. And when he died, things went to his next of kin, who was, he only had like a third cousin who was in another country. So that third cousin, who he probably didn't even know about, or certainly had no relationship, got all the assets from my aunt's estate, and my cousin ended up losing the home that he was living in. And it was catastrophic because he was also left with the expenses for the funerals. So it really is important, because the courts will decide, and the courts aren't going to decide on what's necessarily right or just. They're going to decide what fits within legal precedents. So that's something to really be cautious about. When you die without a will, it's called an interstate. And your property, as I said, will be divided according to the law. And it's certainly not going to be divided the same as how you would have divided. Nobody has that nice cookie cutter life that is easily divisible. And if you've not appointed anybody to be your executor or the person who administers your will, somebody will be appointed for you. And it may not be somebody of your choosing. It might be a child who is disenfranchised from the family. It might be a brother or someone else in the family who just doesn't have that judgment that you would like. And there are going to be extra time delays and extra expenses involved in wrapping up that estate. A couple really significant considerations, and I did not know this, but if you are in a common law relationship and you do not have a will, when one of the spouses die, even though they are in a recognized common law relationship, they have no legal status in an interstate when there is an estate and no will. So they might lose everything. Getting married might fix that, but also just get a will. And also, legitimate and illegitimate children have equal status under the eyes of the law when it comes to interstate considerations after someone has died. Any questions? Just jump in and stop me if you have one. Okay. One of the most important things about doing a will isn't necessarily figuring out how you're going to divide up your assets, but it's really about choosing an executor, choosing that person that is going to steer this process through choppy waters. Some of the qualities and considerations you want to have when appointing an executor, it's obviously they have to be somebody who's trustworthy. Somebody who isn't going to take advantage of that position, somebody who can be objective and diplomatic. I recognize that I am blessed. I have 3 brothers, and not one of them has a mean or greedy bone in their body. So when our parents died, it was a wonderful experience. We shared memories, but I've seen so many families torn apart because that conflict within the families. So you want to have somebody who can be diplomatic, who can be objective, who can be fair to all parties who are beneficiaries of the will. You'll want somebody who is in the same proximity as you. At least in the same province. If you have an executor who lives in a different province, they may be required to provide a security bond to pay for such things as any outstanding debts or any legal fees or taxes such as that. So you really don't want to burden somebody with having to do that. Being an executor of a will takes a lot of time. It's about a 1.5 years of work. Now it's part-time work, but it's like work. So you want somebody who has that time availability and has a little bit of flexibility to be able to do some of those business transactions. You'll want somebody who's detail-oriented. Probably not somebody like me who has 14 piles of paper on their desk at any one time and has to go scratching to figure out what file I put that in. But you want somebody who can keep track of the paperwork, who can keep everybody informed, who can do an itemized list, and just is you have that sense of their competence. You'll want somebody, and I know this sounds ageism, but you want somebody who's young enough and healthy enough to exercise those duties. When you're 65, you probably don't want to appoint your 85-year-old mother or father as your executor. That's just sort of the demographic reality that we live in. You'll need somebody who's going to be comfortable, and comfortable really should have an asterisk and say, and patient in dealing with legal lawyers, financial people, and the government. heaven forbid you have to talk to Veterans Affairs. So you want somebody who can just be calm and persistent, and is quite competent in making those phone calls and connections. And the biggest consideration is to make sure that they're willing to do it. Being appointed somebody's executor should not come as a surprise for anybody. Really recommend making sure that they agree to it, because they can refuse that after your death. When that will comes to light, they can recuse themselves and refuse to be an executor, which puts you back into that basically almost like an interstate will situation. Sometimes you don't have a family member or a close friend who can be the executor to your estate. So in those cases, it's a good idea to have a professional. There are estate trustees. There are also estate lawyers who can do that job for you. This might be your best choice, especially if you don't have any family or no family living close by. If your assets are really complex. If you have a family situation that you know you don't want to put the burden on one specific person. If you have assets or beneficiaries that are located out of the country, you need somebody who has a professional knowledge to navigate that. And especially if you want to ease the burden on a loved one, because it's going to be a difficult time. And it can really take a burden on people to sort of deal with their own grief and at the same time deal with all the paperwork. Any questions? Or? Good. I know there's a lot of information here. We are going to be putting out a booklet in the near future that'll have some checklists and that will cover some of this information. So yeah, if you missed something on a note somewhere, if you're taking notes, then don't worry about that. We will have some more resources available for you. So what do you want to include in your will? I found this cartoon and I couldn't resist. If you can't read it, it says, "And to my nephew Wilbert, I leave my pandemic supply of toilet paper." It's like gold, that and hand sanitizer. So if you are making a handwritten will, for example, or using a template, you of course need to include your full name and where you live, what your address is, a statement canceling any previous wills. You need to do that formal appointment of an executor. And make sure you're clear on the legal name and where they live. And then the bulk of it, though, is what you want to do with your estate. How do you want that to be divided? The first part of that, of course, is a template or sort of a standard statement saying that all your debts and liabilities will be resolved. That just has to happen before the rest of the estate can be divided. And that's really a caveat for those who are executors. Don't start giving out and portioning out the estate before you've really had a close look at all those debts and liabilities, because then you might be responsible. If you've given away all the estate and then you discover that you have to pay, there's $10,000 in debt, because you've already given away the estate, you would be responsible for that $10,000. Whereas if you make sure you look after the debts first, then you just divide the residual after the debts are paid. You also have an opportunity to leave any gifts or bequests. And this is not just to charities or to the church, but this is things that might be a tangible gift to someone you love. You know, it might be a favorite guitar or your upright piano, or you know, a valuable painting or something that you want to assign to a specific person. the division of the residue, or what's left over after the debts have been paid and after the gifts have been given away. You know, you've sold the house, you have $200,000 left. Half of that goes to the spouse, and there's 2 children, so they each get half of the half. However, you decide that you want to apportion that percentage out of the residual of your estate would be specified in your will. Sometimes you need to appoint legal guardians as applicable, and you might also need to identify any ongoing financial obligations. The level of sperm is feeding towards eggs. Okay. This is where it's really helpful to at least, you know, pay a minimum amount if you have to a lawyer, because they know more about what your assets and liabilities could possibly be, because they're in the business of writing wills, and they've probably seen it all, and they have the templates, and can make sure you don't overlook something that could be quite significant later on. Any questions on wills before we move into sort of more detailed area of legacy gifts?
Trying to get it connect to my headphone, but
oh, I think Michael's just talking in the background there. Hi, Mike.
oh,
Can I just make a comment, Trish, while we're on will?
Having worked for a lawyer.
We were talking about residuals, and one important consideration is how you want to leave your residuals. And the terminology that's usually used is per stirpes or per capita, and it's good to be thinking about that, because if you have, say, 3 children, if you leave your estate residue to them per stirpes, that means that if one of your children happens to sadly predecease you, that their children would benefit in the estate as well. Whereas if you leave it per capita, it's only divided among the children who are alive at the time of your death. So that's an important consideration as well.
Thank you. One thing I'll also point out, just going over my notes, when you're also doing your bill, you want to make, or your will, bill, you want to make sure that you have beneficiaries to your insurance policies. You want to make sure that that's consistent with your will. It's probably best just to say that, you know, that's sort of its own thing, that beneficiaries are named in the insurance policies. But if you do somehow say, okay, this insurance is going to go to this person, make sure they're consistent, because otherwise it's going to end up in court, and the lawyers are going to eat up a lot of that, a lot of what that benefit would have been. Okay, just moving on to legacy gifts. I had a seminar, another webinar yesterday on stewardship, talking about legacy gifts, and somebody made the point that your legacy gifts should reflect how you lived, not how you died. And somebody used an example of an obituary notice for somebody who had been a lifelong member of the church, had you know, maybe been on altar guild, you know, been a warden, been a fundraiser, you know, just their whole life had been lived in the church as a person of faith, and somebody who was really committed to the sustainability of their local parish congregation. But when they died, because they had died from cancer, they asked that all memoriam gifts be donated to, for example, the Canadian Cancer Society. And it was just like, the church wasn't there at all, even though the church was in every sort of other line of the obituary. When it came to memorial gifts, it was to what the person had died for. And that seems to be a cultural thing, and we certainly want to recognize those organizations that have we want to make sure this doesn't happen to somebody else. So it makes sense that we want to donate to things like the Cancer Society. But sometimes we just do it because we haven't given it any thought. So talking about legacy gifts gives us a chance to talk about what we want our lasting legacy to be. What do we want our family members to know about how we want our gifts shared after we're gone? So there's a few different ways to give. One of them is called a bequest. And that could be a percentage of your estate. It could be a set sum of money. It could be the gift of property or the gift of sort of securities. The benefit of making a bequest is that it can be a lasting legacy, and it can be for you, for your family, or for anyone you wish to honor. When you're making a bequest, you get to retain the full control of your assets during your lifetime. But that bequest can also provide some tax relief to your state if it's made to a charity or a church with a registered charitable number. So for example, if $10,000 of your estate goes to St. John's Edessa, or St. John's Bath, I should say, or St. Albans Edessa, then that is a charitable donation that helps with any taxes that remain on the estate. One thing I will stay on in terms of bequests, sometimes bequests are made in a will that have some very interesting directions and restrictions on them that don't hold up well over the years. We have so many examples of bequests that are accruing interest in our consolidated investment funds because they are so restrictive that we can't spend them anymore. Maybe it's on, a scholarship fund for an instrument that nobody even plays anymore. Or maybe it's a ministry that is no longer being done. Quite often people will leave money for like a boys' choir when there just isn't that ministry, and the likelihood of that ministry coming back to that congregation anytime soon is slim. Another example is people leaving money to organs for musical instruments. Where some of our smaller churches are going to more flexible things like electric keyboards that can sound like an organ, because it's harder and harder to find actual musicians who can play the organ. So when you're making that bequest, just think about the long-term implications, and hopefully you can trust that if you are making a bequest to the church, that you can trust that they will spend it as good and faithful stewards. Another way you can give is life insurance. And the interesting thing about life insurance is that it's quite affordable to make a significant difference. So you would pay a modest annual premium, but it could result in a significant future legacy. And that might result in some tax savings for you at the same time. So that's certainly something to look into, and we can provide you more details if that's something that interests you. I admit I do not know a lot about listed securities, but that is an option. And listed securities and real estate and tangible property are things you'll probably want to talk about with your financial advisor planned giving representatives like from the foundation or with the diocesan office to talk about how that can be done and what implications that has on your estate. Mm-hmm. Another thing about the tangible property, it's just think about how it might be received. We get a lot of donations of books and art. And sometimes this comes from families because they just don't know what to do with it and they don't want to put it in a yard sale. So they gift it to the church. And it's hard for churches to find. I can see some of you have had that experience. You know, how do you honor the person it is given in memory of when you've run out of wall space? So just think about those things, especially when you're considering them in your will. Any questions on legacy givings and gift planning? It's something that I don't think people put enough prayerful discernment into. It's really a great way to have that lasting legacy and to reflect what your priorities have been in life. And quite often our families don't have the same passion for the church that we do. And that's not going to be their first consideration when they think about, you know, how we want our charitable givings done through our will. And they might just pick other charities that are all worthy charities, but not the same reflection of where we put our value. Questions? All right, we'll move on to funeral planning. I like that. The cartoon says, and finally, I would like to be buried with an elephant bone just to confuse future archaeologists. And Nancy McLeod used to do some archaeology, so yeah, I'm sure that would have people wondering why. There are benefits to doing funeral planning. The first and foremost is to reduce that burden on the family after the time of death. When a loved one dies, whether it's expected or sudden, you are thrown into a tailspin. And it's really hard to think straight, and you have so many things coming at you and so many decisions to make, and you're not always in the most sound mind. And we don't want you to live with the regret of the decision that you made in the moment when you were in grief. So having that funeral planning done ahead of time, you know, writing down whatever you can, it really helps your family during that time. There is a difference between pre-planning and pre-arranging, sort of making the plan and prepaying it. If you're not in a position to prepay funeral arrangements, you can at least do some of that planning ahead of time and try to think about the financial considerations of that. So at least your family has something to work with. When you do that pre-arrangement and you've prepaid for that, that certainly reduces a financial burden on your family. It's also going to minimize potential conflict. I've seen families where the sister who's in charge of making the arrangements wants the most elaborate casket and a vault and you know, all the bells and whistles, whereas the other siblings are like, yeah, but that's eating into our share of the residual of the estate, and dad wouldn't have wanted that. So if you have those pre-planning things done, it's going to mitigate some of those conflicts in families. You get to have a say in your planning. You're not going to be there in body, maybe in spirit, but this way you get to have a say in how you want to be celebrated, how you want to be memorialized. It's also, pre-planning is going to work to be more meaningful. when you've had a say in even the service details, things like music or readings, it's going to be better reflective of your life if you've had that say in pre-planning the funeral. It's going to be more authentic. So what are the things that we want to consider when we are doing some of that pre-planning for our death, the service, and the burial? First thing, and it's probably not the first thing on everybody's list, but one of the things to consider is sort of what your financial picture looks like. What's your budget? It's almost along the same lines as the wedding industry, where you can have a bride with a limited amount of money who works within her budget, or you could have the bridezilla or the couplezilla who you know, go $60,000 into debt on their wedding when, you know, they could have gotten away with $5,000 or $6,000. So, you know, at least give some consideration to sort of that order of magnitude of what you'd like to be around, so as to not burden your family, but to give them some guidance. Funeral costs range wildly. They can go anything from $1,500 to $20,000 or more, depending on what is involved. Things that you have to consider are things like the funeral home services or the cremation services, not like the funeral memoriam in the funeral home, but the things that activities that they do, the professional activities they do in terms of transportation, preparing the body, those kind of things. And that again can range anywhere from, you know, $1,000 to $8,000 or $9,000. There are more expensive options and cheaper options. If you're looking for something a little more on the less expensive, you can look at a cremation service instead of a full funeral home. I know a lot of people, especially during this time of pandemic, when we have been having just graveside funerals, there haven't been as many funeral homes involved. The family would just have their loved one cremated, and they would bring the cremated remains themselves, and we would have just a small graveside service. Some things to consider is whether you do want cremation or whether you want a casket. And if you want a casket, do you want it open or closed? That's important stuff for you to share with your family, and for them to share with you. You know, that might be just a bridge too far. You might want an open casket, but they're considering the grandchildren and how that might affect them. So these are all good conversations to have with your family members. Couple things to think about in terms of a place of burial. Do you want to be buried in a cemetery? Can you buy the access to the plot ahead of time? Do you want to be buried with your spouse? So sort of if you're having cremation done, do you want to be both placed at the same time? So somebody wouldn't be necessarily buried right away. A couple of the other things to consider is who do you want notified in the event of death? It's nice to have a list for somebody to refer to, because again, in that moment of shock, you might not know who to call or can't find the numbers. Give some consideration to how you would like your obituary written. You might not get that final say. Your family might put in what they want to put in anyhow. But you know, it's a chance for you to reflect what was important in your life. What was, you know, sort of the most important? Was it your profession? Was it your friends? Was it your faith? You know, was it your passions and your hobbies or your pets? You know, if you spend some time, you get to reflect that, and people reading it then can respond, and it's more meaningful to them because they feel more connected. I just want to say a word about memorial contributions. A lot of people say, in lieu of flowers, please donate to certain charities. Again, give that some thought ahead of time. Families usually pick the first thing that pops into their head, and that could be anything from, you know, Salvation Army, humane societies. It's whatever they've heard most recently on the radio or TV quite often, because that's just their state of mind. So if you have an idea where you'd like memorial gifts to go, make sure you know, share that with people, and have a place where you write it all down. Just a few words about a funeral service. I've talked to a lot of families, and their loved ones might have gone to church every Sunday their entire life, heavily involved in the church, you know, member of the ACW and Altar Guild, or somebody who's been a warden, a treasurer, somebody who's been just part of the fabric of the church. And we get to that place where I ask about, you know, their loved ones' favorite hymns or favorite readings, and they say, you go ahead and pick. And it's just, and I might know the person and might have an idea what would fit. But again, that's just my thought. And it doesn't authentically reflect the person that we're coming together to give thanks to God for their life and witness. So think about how you want your funeral done. What kind of things you want in your funeral? Where do you want it? Do you want a funeral in the church? Do you want it just at the funeral home? Is there some other place? Do you want just a graveside service? In terms of a Eucharist, we're having less and less funerals that do have a Eucharist, but that is an option. And it's however you feel comfortable. If that was something that was important in your life and faith, it should be something that's important at your funeral service as well. It's good to think about what kind of music you want, whether you want live music, somebody to play the organ, or you want something that is a hymn, or if you want maybe a secular song. Some consideration to what the clergy can accommodate if it is in the church. I've had some obscure requests. Sorry, ACDC is not cutting it. We have some stuff that's just wildly inappropriate, but it's a good way to reflect those things that you really liked. I do have a funny story on that. We were at a funeral for a funeral director of all things, well known in the community. And he really didn't like sort of the traditional gospel music, like How Great Thou Art. He was more of a country and Western. Those were the only two kinds of music that existed. And while we were waiting for his funeral to start, one of these gospel hymns came up on the radio, on the speaker, and all the power went out in the funeral home. And we laughed because we thought, oh, he is here. He did that on purpose. So in that case, playing music that wasn't his style sort of reminded us of him, but it's not the way it's usually done. Again, just like music, it's helpful to think about what kind of scripture you want. You know, what's your favorite psalm? What gospel would you like? And your clergy have lots of examples to give you ideas. you know, we're happy to share those in the Book of Alternative Services at the end of the section with all the funeral services. It does have a list of suitable readings for funerals. So see what stirs your heart, what you would really like to have read at your funeral. And then the last point there is about participants. Who is it that you would like to speak? Would you like somebody, you know, is there somebody you would love to do the eulogy, who would like to do a reading? And again, this comes back to, are they going to be willing? You know, some people just can't do it. They can't speak in public, especially something like that. But maybe you have a granddaughter who sings beautifully, and you know, and you'd love to have her sing as a gift to everybody. So just think about those things. And again, these are your wishes. You're not going to be there to police it. And in the end, the family does get to make the decision, because the funeral is a celebration of life, as you know, we pray that the person's been received into God's mercy, but it's for the living, to give them comfort and to give them that perspective and surround them in the love of the faith in the resurrection. Okay. Final thoughts. And yes, I intended that pun. Again, the most important thing when you're talking about your will, when you're talking about planning how you want to leave those lasting legacy gifts, when you're talking about your funeral plans, is to communicate. And I know it's difficult to have those conversations. I know certainly even when my mother was palliative with lung cancer, and you know, she wanted to talk about it, it's like, oh no, we'll talk about those things later. You know, don't want to talk about it now. There's always another time to talk about it. But talk about it when you don't have to talk about it. Just make it a natural part of that conversation. And it's not anything to be afraid of. It's part of our journey. It's something to celebrate our passage from this life to the next life. And you know, if we can destigmatize that, that's going to be healthy for everybody in the long run. Don't be afraid to ask your clergy questions. As I say here, if nothing else, we've been to a lot of funerals. We've seen what's worked, what hasn't worked, you know, what has really touched people, and we can make some sound recommendations on help you find what you want to include in your service. And the other part is to not assume that people already know what's on your heart. People know what you want, because they might not, or people might have assumed different things, especially in families. You know, you might be really close, you might not be really close. But if you're not sort of communicating that to all the family members, then people are just going to fill in the blanks themselves. That brings me to the end. Oh, one other thing, should have read my notes. When I talked about don't be afraid to talk about death, just a reminder that on average, Jesus talked about his own death 3 times in each of the synoptic gospels. So if Jesus can talk about his own death, so can we. I will stop the screen sharing and then open it up if you have any specific questions. Oh, John, I think you're still on. There we go. Is there any questions, John or Heather?
One question from earlier on, that in writing the holograph will, the whole thing has to be handwritten to be valid. Does it need 2 witnesses?
No. If it is completely handwritten and you've signed it and dated it, it doesn't need the witnesses.
But 2 witnesses would be for a template that you pick up somewhere.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. And yeah, I think you answered one other question that I was wondering about is just, I mean, I don't want to be cheap, but I don't want to spend all kinds of money on useless funeral home, all that kind of stuff. How do we go about pre-planning? Like, do we just pick a funeral home, or?
Yeah, you can start there, again, depending on how complex you want it to be. If you just want sort of your remains to be cremated and your family to plan a service in the church or graveside or whatever, like if you don't need the funeral home for visitations or the service, and you just want to do it that way, you can go to a cremation service, or talk to a funeral home. And if you have the option, talk to a couple, get a couple estimates, and see, what they're trying to sell you. I was, both my parents' funerals were pretty on the inexpensive side. But I have this leather box in my room that all the sort of memoriam cards were in. And I'm like, how much did we pay for this? And why did we pay for this? I know there was a good reason at the time, but it was just like, this is ridiculous. Same thing with urns. It's like, okay, I can get a $20 ginger jar, a nice vase with a jar lid for the cremains, or I can spend $600 on a pretty box. So yeah, it depends on your own personal wants. Some people want the whole gold painted vault and the stainless steel casket and stretch limos to drive the family to the graveside. There's a whole spectrum, just like there's a spectrum with weddings. So, but yeah, talk to a funeral home or two.
And I would just mention there too, not just the funeral homes, but there are other people who are licensed funeral directors who provide lower cost, but certainly not lower quality services in many cases that are just more simple. I know there are some in our area, and if you make inquiries in your area and look and check them out, you want to find out that they're reputable. But there are certainly people who are perfectly above board and will do everything necessary and deal with you graciously without nearly the cost of a funeral home. And if your intent is that you want things in your church, that funeral home space may not be something that's necessary.
And they will also deal with the body and everything?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We happen to have one who is a member of our parish. And yes, and everything that I have heard is that she does wonderful work, is extremely professional and competent about it. And there are quite a number of those. You don't see them as often. You might have to go looking for it a little bit more because the funeral homes will make sure they have more advertising presence, but they are there.
Okay.
I faded out when you had the place of burial with the asterisks. What were you saying?
Yeah, it's just in terms of maybe you don't want to be buried. For example, my mom's remains are sitting on my brother's mantle because, there's just, nobody knows where to bury them. My dad wanted to be buried in his family plot, but my mom didn't want to be part of that. And my brother anticipates that he's going to be moving, so he wants to wait until he moves, and it's just, yeah. So you don't always have a place of burial. Some people just do the release of ashes. Lots of different options there. That's why it's just sort of with the asterisks, just in case that's if applicable.
But that is illegal, isn't it? The spreading ashes?
In certain places, certain situations, like where it's like an environmental, but I don't know. I don't.
There certainly are a number of actually cemeteries now that have places where it is specifically a place for spreading ashes, and there are a number, as Trish said, there are environmental concerns, but you can, and I'm just double checking here, and it still says yes, you can still spread ashes on crown land and land covered by water. And if you want to do it on private land, you need the owner's consent. And I know I have been involved in situations where people have chosen to have their ashes spread at the home that they had lived in. And that is, if there is permission there, that there's nothing illegal about that.
So that also brings up a question about, you know, in 500 years when all our descendants are wondering how to find us, because that if we did that, then there would be no, you know, no burial plots or anything. But there's people go by records, and I would think the internet's still going to be around too, right?
Or some facsimile thereof. If you think about grave markers from 500 years ago, you can't read them. You can't identify, I mean, if there was any legible writing on them, you can't identify them now. So, you know, the best we can do is sort of the late 1800s, unless they've been very well preserved in a lot of our...
That's still better than computers. I can't open that word perfect document from 20 years ago.
I can. I still use Word Perfect.
But exactly.
Drives Trish crazy, but I do. That's something to consider, though, as you said, in terms of that record. I mean, people do family trees. Maybe that's something in your family that you want to start keeping a record of where people have been either buried or had their ashes scattered, or what may have been the case. So there is that continuing legacy for people to trace.
Yeah.
That was helpful to help focus some of our ideas. We have a will in progress right now.
Oh, great.
It's been in progress for a few months. We've already talked to the lawyer once. We just had to, you know, decide on certain things.
Mm-hmm.
We had homework and we haven't done it.
Yeah.
And I would, having worked for a lawyer in wills and estates for some time, I would say that although holographic wills are perfectly acceptable, if you have significant assets and you have the likelihood of anybody being contentious about it, it is much better to have it documented in more formal ways, because people are more likely to say that it's not really your holographic will. And I have seen that happen.
Well, it's not our intent.
Yeah. It's more like a emergency placeholder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I keep telling her if she doesn't start behaving, one day it'll happen. She stole
I'm
all
going to
my
remind you,
pens.
we're still recording.
She stole all my pens last week.
Well, that's a just cause. Any other questions? Thanks. So we are working on sort of and that estate guide and sort of that checklist for funeral planning. I need to get a letter to the bishop so he can sort of make it his own and get some more pictures to make it pretty. But we're hoping to have that out within the next few weeks, and that'll be available on the diocesan website. And I'm sure Mark will have a link in the e-news. So if you follow e-news, keep an eye out for that.
If you want anybody to take a look at it and just give you some feedback, we'd be happy to look at a pilot or whatever.
Great. I'll let you do an early version. Yeah, it's just a PDF. But yeah, that'll be perfect. And I lost what I was going to say next. Yeah. So I thank you for taking part. And if there's other topics on stewardship or similar topics that you'd like, please let us know. We're happy to sort of run these little webinars and you know, figure out what resources and information they need.
So, okay, one other thing, just because we had thought about it or talked about it with some of our, I guess, financial planners, and it came up with our lawyer too, is about gifts of life insurance or other, you know, annuities and stuff like that. But it's sort of a specialized area of talking about, like you said, that, and even our money guy didn't say our financial planner, he wasn't prepared to talk about it. I think in terms of putting it in wills and what it does to your taxes and all that kind of stuff. So,
okay.
Yeah, we have a friend who was working with the Hospital Foundation, and I think they used to run a lot of seminars. And then, of course, CNIB was giving courses on it. I think every charity in the world has got people who are experts on it.
And every university.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, these huge charitable fundraiser professionals, they know all the ins and outs. In life insurance, I think is fairly straightforward in terms of basically taking out that life insurance policy, and it becomes just sort of like that benefit that's paid to whoever the beneficiary is. And I think there's some tax benefit for the premiums. Maybe it's not the financial planner, maybe it's whoever is looking after, like, I don't know if you have life insurance, but that person might be able to guide you a little bit better about that. They certainly would know.
And the Anglican Church of Canada website does have some information and contact people by email and phone as well about that.
Yeah, because I think there was something where you could give a substantial gift to a charity, and then you live off the interest for the rest of your life, but you also get a tax benefit at some point, and blah blah blah, and they get their, so yeah. Okay, I don't know that we're rich enough to be able to do that.
Yeah, probably if your financial planner doesn't know, whoever is looking after your insurance or your life insurance should be able to.
Okay, great.
Wow. Okay.
Well, thank you.
All right. If there's no other questions, then maybe we could just end our time with saying the grace together. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Thank you so much. All right. And please feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. Reverend Trish at gmail.com. Or sorry, Rev Trish Miller at gmail.com. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.